She did not know it yet, that rain-soaked morning with her hands full of mending, that within the year she would stand in the most glittering ballroom in London and hear a duke, in front of every soul who had ever called her plain, tell the whole of the ton that he loved her. She did not know it, but the letter that would carry her there was already 3 days from her door. The rain had been falling over Hartfield Manor for 3 days without pause, the kind of grey autumn rain that did not announce itself with thunder, but simply arrived and stayed, seeping into the stone until the whole house smelled of damp wool and old smoke. The gutters had long since given up their duty, and water ran in thin silver ropes past the study window where Sir Robert Vane sat with his head in his hands and a letter from his creditor open on the desk before him. The candles guttered in a draught that came from a window frame no one had thought to repair in a decade, because there had been no money for repairs in a decade, and there would be less tomorrow. Down the corridor, in a parlour with a fire that had been allowed to burn low, Eleanor Vane sat mending a hem by the grudging light of a single candle, while her mother and her younger sister discussed, at some length, the exact shade of blue that would best suit Louisa's complexion at the coming assembly in Hartfield Village. Eleanor was 23, tall in a way that was not fashionable, with a face that had never once been called beautiful by anyone in her family, and had long since stopped expecting to be. Her hair was a plain brown, her eyes a plain grey, and she had learned early that in a household with 2 daughters, and only enough attention for one, she was not the one who received it. "You are letting the candle gutter, Eleanor," her mother said without looking at her. "Wax is not so cheap that you may waste it staring into nothing. I was only thinking, Mama. Thinking does very little for a young woman's prospects. Louisa, turn so I may see the drape of the sleeve." Louisa turned, obligingly, prettily, the firelight catching gold in hair that Eleanor's own mother had once, years ago, called the finest in the county, and Eleanor bent her head back to her mending and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change the arrangement of the room, the weight of attention in it, or the fact that she had long ago stopped being surprised by her own invisibility at her own hearth. She had grown a kind of quiet around herself, not from bitterness, but from necessity, the way a plant grows toward whatever light is left to it even when that light is thin. It was into this house, 3 days later, that the letter came from London that would change everything, though none of them yet understood the shape it would take. Sir Robert had gambled, not extravagantly, not viciously, but steadily, the way a man does when he does not quite believe the numbers can catch him, across 2 decades of small debts that had, through the alchemy of interest and negligence, become one very large one. The holder of that debt was a solicitor acting for the Duke of Rothwell, a man Sir Robert had met only twice in his life, and feared considerably more than he feared his own conscience. The letter did not threaten. It did not need to. It simply stated, in the cool language of men who did not raise their voices because they had never needed to, that His Grace was prepared to discuss a settlement of the debt in full, and that His Grace would receive Sir Robert at Rothwell House the following Tuesday to discuss the particulars. Sir Robert did not tell his wife what particulars might mean. He suspected, correctly, that his wife would have opinions about which daughter ought to be offered as particulars, and he did not have the courage yet to hear them. He sat a long while after the letter had been read 3 times over, turning his signet ring on his finger, remembering the young man he had been before the cards had ever tempted him, before he had learned that a bad evening at the tables could be forgotten with a better one the following week, until the weeks became years, and the years became a debt too large to ever forget again. He thought of his daughters, both of them, and felt the particular shame of a father who knows he has failed one child by favoring the other without ever quite deciding to. He had not meant to overlook Eleanor. He had simply never had to notice her, because she had never once given him cause for worry, and a man drowning in his own debts learns, without meaning to attend only to the children who demand it of him. It occurred to him, sitting there in the guttering candlelight, that this might be the first time in years he had thought of Eleanor at all as anything other than a quiet, reliable presence at the edge of the household, and the thought did not sit easily with him. But he set it aside, as he had set aside a great many uncomfortable thoughts over the years, and went to bed without resolving it. Gideon Ashworth, 9th Duke of Rothwell, had not slept properly in longer than he could accurately recall. He sat now in the estate office at Rothwell House, at an hour when any sensible man would have long since gone to bed. A single lamp burning low over ledgers that told the same story they had told every night for 3 years. A dukedom vast in name and threadbare in substance, mortgaged twice over by a father who had preferred the turn of a card to the running of an estate, and a son left to unwind, line by line, year by year, the tangle his father's charm and carelessness had left behind. He was not an unkind man, though London had decided, in the absence of better information, that he was a cold one. He simply no longer had the appetite for warmth that required explanation. He had learned that lesson at 24, when a young woman he had trusted with something dangerously close to his whole heart had accepted his courtship with every appearance of affection, and then, upon discovering the true state of his finances before the engagement was announced, had quietly and efficiently transferred her attentions to a viscount with better liquidity. She had not been cruel about it. That, somehow, had been worse. She had simply looked at him as a column of figures and found the sum wanting. He had built, since then, a study, a schedule, and a self that did not invite anyone close enough to do that again. His grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, told him regularly that he was turning into his uncle Aldous, a man who had died alone in a house full of servants who could not remember the last time he had laughed. Gideon told her, regularly, that he had a dukedom to save and no time for laughing. Both of them knew this was not entirely an answer. Tonight, the ledger in front of him concerned Sir Robert Vane, a baronet of modest land and immodest debt, whose note Gideon had acquired, along with several others, in the general untangling of his father's affairs. He could have called it in and ruined the man. He had no particular wish to ruin anyone. Ruin solved nothing, and satisfied only the pettiest part of a man's pride. What he needed, with a practicality that had become the whole architecture of his adult life, was not vengeance, but a wife of sound character, who understood that a marriage could be a working partnership rather than a performance. Someone who would not flinch at ledgers or expect to be dazzled. Someone who wanted, as he did, a life built on something sturdier than affection that could be bought away by better prospects. He had made inquiries, quietly, through his solicitor, about the Vane household. He had learned that there were 2 daughters. He had learned that the younger was accounted the beauty, and was, by every report, aware of it. He had learned, almost as an afterthought from a servant's cousin in service to the family, that the elder daughter kept the household accounts in her head, because her father could not be troubled with them, negotiated with the butcher and the draper on credit no one else could secure, and had once walked 4 miles in the rain to sit with a dying tenant's wife, because no one else in the family thought a groundskeeper's family worth the discomfort. He had not yet met her, but he had, in the quiet arithmetic of his own mind, already made his choice. Sir Robert returned from London grave-faced, and would not meet his wife's eye at dinner. It was Eleanor, not Louisa, who found him afterward in the study, staring at nothing, and it was Eleanor who drew the whole account from him in the end. Because she was the one who always drew such accounts from him, the one who had learned to ask the right quiet questions, in the right quiet voice. The Duke of Rothwell held the whole of the family's debt. The Duke of Rothwell required a wife. The Duke of Rothwell had asked, specifically, plainly, without any softening flourish, for the elder Miss Vane. He asked for me, Eleanor said, and something in her chest went very still, not with hope, not yet, but with the strange vertigo of being, for the first time in her life, the one who was wanted, rather than the one who was overlooked in favor of someone prettier. You need not do it, her father said, though they both understood the sentence for the fiction it was. Without the marriage, there was no way to satisfy the debt that did not end in the loss of the house, the land, and whatever remained of the family's standing, such as it was. Eleanor sat a long moment in the low firelight, and she found that she was not afraid, not precisely. She was something else. She was, for the first time, she could remember, being asked to make a decision rather than simply absorb one that had been made around her, and there was a strange cold clarity in that. "I will meet him," she said. "Before I agree to anything, I will meet him myself, alone, and I will tell him my terms." Her mother, informed of this the next morning, declared it an impertinence that would see the whole arrangement collapse before it began, that no duke living would tolerate a chit of a girl setting terms to him as though she were a merchant striking a bargain. Eleanor, folding a shawl with hands that did not shake nearly as much as she expected them to, said only that a merchant striking a bargain was precisely what she intended to be, because it was, in fact, precisely what was being asked of her, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise for the sake of appearances that had never once served her. The audience was arranged for the following week, in the Duke's townhouse on a square so quiet and so correctly kept that Eleanor, arriving in her one good grey travelling dress, felt every inch the poor relation she had never quite stopped being in her own home. She was shown into a library, not a drawing room, which she noted and filed away as either an insult or an honesty. She was not yet certain which. The Duke of Rothwell stood when she entered. He was younger than she had expected, and colder in bearing than she had expected, and something in the set of his shoulders suggested a man permanently braced against a blow that had already landed once and might land again. He did not smile. He offered her a chair with the exact courtesy owed to a stranger and no more. "Miss Vane," he said, "I understand you asked to speak with me before any arrangement was finalized." "I did, Your Grace." Eleanor did not sit. "Not yet. I am given to understand that my father's debt to you is considerable, and that a marriage to me would settle it. I wish to understand, first, what you require of a wife, because I do not intend to enter into an arrangement blindly, whatever my family's circumstances may compel." Something crossed his face that might, in a warmer man, have been surprise. In him it registered only as a slight stillness, a recalculation. "Direct," he said. "I had not expected that. I have had very little practice at being anything else useful, Your Grace. My family has found other qualities in me wanting." He studied her for a long moment, and she made herself hold still under it, the way she had learned to hold still under her mother's assessments, though this gaze felt different, weighing something other than the fashionable curve of a cheek. "I require," he said slowly, as though testing each word before he committed to it, "a wife who will manage this dukedom as a partner and not as an ornament. I have no patience left for decoration, Miss Vane. I have spent 3 years unpicking the ruin my father's charm left behind, and I find I have very little affection remaining for charm as a quality in itself. I require someone with a level head, a steady hand, and no illusions about what this marriage is. Then I believe we may deal well together," Eleanor said, and drew a breath, and told him her terms. She required first that her younger brother Thomas, 12 years old and delicate in his lungs since a fever 2 winters past, be given a proper education and, should he wish it, a living or a commission, suited to his health when the time came, secured independently of whatever affection, or lack of affection, existed between herself and her husband. She required, second, that she be given real work in the running of whichever estate she came to, not the honorary oversight of menus and flowers that was typically allotted to a lady of the house, but genuine authority over the household accounts, and, where her ability proved itself, a voice in the estate's affairs more broadly. And she required, third, and she made herself say this one plainly though it cost her more than the others, that she be treated as a woman of sense, and not merely tolerated as a solution to a financial embarrassment, that whatever this marriage was, it be conducted with respect. The Duke of Rothwell was silent for long enough that Eleanor began to recatalogue, with some private grief, the ways in which she had perhaps overreached. Then he said, "You have not asked for jewels, or a house in town, or an allowance for gowns. I did not think you the kind of man impressed by a woman who asked for gowns, your grace, and I confess I am not, myself, greatly moved by them." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the almost. "No," he said, "I do not think you are." He rose, crossed to the desk, and returned with not a jewel case, as she half expected despite herself, but a slim leather-bound ledger, plain, unadorned, the kind of book a steward might carry. He set it in her hands. "If you are in earnest about the accounts," he said, "you may begin with this. It is the household ledger for Rothwell Park. My steward will resist you. My grandmother will not. You will find both facts useful in roughly equal measure." He paused. "Your terms are acceptable, Miss Vane. All of them." Eleanor stood in the quiet library with a stranger's ledger in her hands, heavier than any jewel she had ever been offered, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely seen. She did not yet know that this ledger, plain and unadorned as it was, would become the truest thing either of them ever gave the other, that a year from that evening she would still be keeping it, worn soft at the corners, while a room full of London's finest learned exactly what it had cost her to earn it. The wedding was quiet, correct, and entirely without the sort of romance that filled the novels Louisa liked to borrow from the circulating library. Eleanor thought, standing in the small parish church in a gown that was serviceable rather than fine, that this suited her better than any dream she might once have allowed herself, because it asked nothing of her that she could not honestly give. Rothwell Park, when the carriage finally delivered her to it after 2 days' travel, rose out of the Yorkshire mist like something out of one of Louisa's novels after all. Grey stone, high windows, a great avenue of lime trees gone shaggy with neglect, and behind it all, half glimpsed through an iron gate gone rust red, the ghost of what had once been a walled garden and was now a wilderness of bramble and dead rose canes. The Dowager Duchess of Rothwell received her in the hall with a cane she did not appear to need, and eyes that missed nothing. "So," the old woman said, walking a slow circle around Eleanor, as though inspecting a horse she was considering purchasing, "you are the one who asked for a ledger instead of a necklace." "I did, your grace." "Good." The dowager's mouth twitched, an expression Eleanor would come to know well over the following months as the older woman's version of delight. The last one wanted only the necklace. "Come along, girl. We have a great deal of work to do, and my grandson will be no help to either of us. He thinks work is done by sitting alone in a room being unhappy about numbers." Mr. Higgins, the estate steward, proved considerably less delighted by the new Duchess's interest in his ledgers than the Dowager had been. He was a careful man, and careful men did not, as a rule, welcome a young bride poring over his columns with a small frown and an alarming habit of asking precisely the questions he had hoped no one would ask. Within a fortnight, Eleanor had found, in the accounts for the home farm, a discrepancy that had been quietly bleeding money for 3 years, through a tenancy arrangement no one had troubled to renegotiate since the old Duke's time. Within a month she had found 2 more. She did not announce these discoveries with triumph. She brought them, instead, quietly to her husband's study one evening, laid the ledger open on his desk beside his own candle, and said only, "I believe this figure is wrong, and I believe I know why." Gideon looked at the column she indicated for a long moment, and then at her, and something in his face rearranged itself slightly, the way stone settles after a long frost. "You are correct," he said. "How long did it take you to find it?" "A fortnight." "Mr. Higgins did not wish to show me the farm accounts at all. I had to ask 3 times, and then simply sit in his office until he gave them to me." "Did you?" Gideon said, and there it was again, that almost smile, gone as quickly as it came, but she had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to watch for it. The garden became hers by a kind of accident that was not entirely an accident. She had gone walking one grey afternoon to escape the house's silence, which was a different silence than her father's house had ever held, not the silence of being unseen, but the silence of a household still learning how to breathe around a grief it had not named, and found the walled garden behind its rusted gate. And among the bramble, Unmistakably, the ghost of a rosebed, one single white rosebush having somehow, stubbornly, survived 3 years of neglect to put out a handful of blooms against all sense. She asked the head gardener about it. He told her, carefully, that the garden had been the late Duchess's, Gideon's mother's, pride, and that after her death. And then after the old Duke's ruin and death not long behind her, no one had had the heart, or the funds, to keep it. Eleanor did not ask permission. She simply began, an hour here, an hour there, to clear the bramble herself, her hands roughened, her second-best gown ruined beyond rescue by the second week, and slowly, through the autumn, and into winter, a portion of the garden began to remember what it had once been. Gideon found her there one evening, kneeling in the frost-hardened earth with dirt to her elbows, and stood a long moment at the gate without announcing himself, watching her work with a steadiness and a care that asked nothing of anyone watching, that existed entirely for its own sake, because the work itself mattered to her, not because anyone would praise her for it. She did not know she was observed. It was, he thought, the truest thing he had yet seen of her, not the ledgers, not the careful terms she had negotiated in his library, but this, a woman on her knees in cold earth, reviving something dead because it deserved reviving, with no one there to see it, and no expectation that anyone ever would. He said nothing that evening, but he found afterward that the memory of her kneeling in that ruined garden had lodged itself somewhere he could not easily dislodge it, and he began without entirely deciding to, watching for her at breakfast, listening for her step in the corridor, keeping, in some private ledger of his own that he did not examine too closely, an account of every small thing she did that no one had asked her to do, and that she did anyway. There came, that same winter, a second moment he would keep longer still. An elderly groundskeeper named Fenwick, who had served the estate since before Gideon's own father inherited it, had grown too slow with his rheumatism to keep pace with the new bailiff's expectations. And the bailiff, a brisk man newly hired and eager to prove his efficiency, had given notice that Fenwick's cottage would be wanted for a younger man before the month was out. Gideon had not yet learned of it. Eleanor had, because she made it her habit to learn the names of every soul on the estate, down to the scullery maids and the boy who minded the pigs, in a manner that startled the household considerably, accustomed as they were to a family that had, for 3 generations, scarcely troubled to learn the names of anyone above stairs, let alone below it. She found the bailiff in the estate office, and did not raise her voice, though what she said left no doubt whatsoever of her meaning. Fenwick had given 40 years to this land, she told him, and a man who could no longer dig might yet mend fences, teach a boy his trade, and keep an old woman's garden growing, and any efficiency purchased at the cost of turning out a man of 70 with nowhere else to go was not efficiency she would permit under her husband's name. She arranged, within the week and entirely without consulting Gideon, for Fenwick to be moved to lighter duties in the walled garden itself, where his slow hands proved, if anything, gentler with the roses than the younger men's had been. Gideon learned of the whole matter only by accident, coming upon Fenwick and Eleanor together in the garden one grey morning, the old man showing her, with evident pride, a graft he had made on the white rosebush years before that had somehow survived the neglect and was, that spring, putting out its first new growth in a decade. Gideon stood at the gate a long while, unseen, and watched his wife listen to an old groundskeeper's account of a rose graft with the same close, genuine attention she gave to the estate ledgers, asking questions not to be polite, but because she wished, plainly, to understand, and he understood, watching her, that this, not the ledgers alone, not even the garden alone, but this steady, unbought attention she gave to people no one else troubled to notice, was the truest measure of the woman he had married, and he found himself, without quite deciding to, falling rather thoroughly in love with her. Winter loosened its hold slowly that year, and it was Thomas's letter, arriving with the first thaw. That seemed to Eleanor to mark the true turn of the season more than any change in the weather. "His cough is nearly gone," she told Gideon one evening in the small parlor where they had taken, without either of them quite deciding it, to sitting after supper, she with the household ledger open across her knees, he with an estate map he was not, in truth, reading. "The school physician has stopped calling on him altogether. And he has adopted a dog. A terrible, ugly thing, by his own account, which he loves beyond all reason. Then he is thriving," Gideon said, and something in his voice, a warmth he had not troubled to hide as carefully as he once might have, made her look up from the ledger. "He says I look happier than he has ever seen me," she said. He wrote it as though it surprised him. "Does it surprise you?" Eleanor considered the question longer than its size seemed to warrant. "I had not noticed it happening. I have simply been busy. The farm accounts, the garden, old Fenwick's grafting. I had not thought to ask myself whether I was happy in the midst of it. And now that you have asked." She looked at him properly then, at the lamp turning his face gold and tired and, for once, unguarded. "I find I am," she said, which I had not expected to say of a marriage that began as a settlement of debt. It was in these evenings, more than in any single declared moment, that whatever stood between them shifted from arrangement into something neither of them had yet named. He told her, one such night with the fire burned low, of the woman who had once accepted his courtship and then measured him, when his fortune faltered, and found the sum wanting. Told her plainly, watching her face for the pity, or the quiet calculation he had braced for, and finding in her only a stillness that asked nothing of him but the truth. She told him, in turn, of 20 years spent as the daughter who was not the pretty one, of candles she had been scolded for wasting on thoughts no one had ever troubled to ask after. Neither of them called it courtship. Both of them understood, without saying so, exactly what it was. It was the Dowager Duchess who finally said the word aloud, over tea, with the particular bluntness of a woman who had earned the right to say whatever she pleased. "You are in love with your own wife," she informed Gideon, and making a great muddle of not admitting it, which is, I will say, an improvement on your father, who was in love with several other men's wives, and made no muddle about admitting that at all. Gideon did not deny it. He found, rather to his own surprise, that he did not want to. The Dowager, for her part, had taken Eleanor in hand from the very first week with a thoroughness that brooked no argument. She was not. She informed Eleanor over their first private supper together, going to pretend that London society was kind to women who arrived without fortune, without dazzling beauty, and without the polish of a childhood spent in dancing master's care, because it was not, and pretending otherwise would only leave Eleanor unprepared for the teeth hidden beneath the smiles. But teeth, the Dowager said, could be managed, provided one knew where to expect them. "You will never out pretty Cecilia Featherstone," the Dowager told her bluntly one afternoon, naming for the first time the girl whose mother's ambitions Eleanor's marriage had quietly ended. "And you need not try. Let them underestimate you as long as they please. It is a great advantage, being underestimated, provided you do not waste time believing them." Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that she liked the old woman enormously, and that the Dowager's brisk, unsentimental affection filled some space in her that her own mother's preoccupation with Louisa had left hollow for 20 years. It was the Dowager who noticed, before Eleanor herself quite admitted it, the particular way Eleanor's shoulders eased whenever Gideon entered a room, and it was the Dowager who began, with the patience of a woman playing a very long game, to arrange more suppers for 3 more quiet evenings in the library, where ledgers might plausibly require 2 heads bent over them, rather than 1. There was the evening Eleanor taught Gideon the trick her old nurse had shown her for reviving a fire gone stubbornly to embers, and he had laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unfamiliar in that house that a footman in the corridor had nearly dropped a tray at the sound of it. There was the evening he found her mending a torn hem by candlelight, rather than ringing for her maid, and instead of remarking on it he had simply fetched a second candle without being asked, so that she might see her stitches better, and sat with her in companionable silence until the hem was done. There was the morning she reorganized the breakfast room so the morning sun, which the old arrangement had wasted entirely, fell instead across the table where they took their tea. A small thing, an unremarkable thing, that nonetheless meant Gideon began, without noticing when it started, to look forward to mornings in a house that had for years given him very little reason to. She learned every servant's name within her first 2 months, from the scullery maid to the stable boys, and asked after a housemaid's ailing mother and a groom's new child, with the same close attention she gave the ledgers, until the whole household, accustomed under the old Duke to being invisible furniture in their own home, began to speak of the new Duchess with a warmth that startled even the Dowager, who had seen a great many brides come and go without ever once troubling to learn a housemaid's Christian name. But Rothwell Park's recovery, and its Duchess's growing steadiness in it, had not gone unnoticed in London, where a great deal of idleness among the fashionable classes had, over the winter, curdled into a very particular kind of interest, the kind that fed on any bride who arrived without beauty, without fortune of her own, and without the ordinary credentials that made a match unremarkable. Lady Featherstone, a widow of considerable social reach, and a daughter of her own, a pretty ambitious girl named Cecilia, had, before the Vane match was announced, entertained real hopes of securing the Duke of Rothwell for Cecilia, hopes that had been quietly and definitively ended by his marriage to a baronet's plain, portionless elder daughter. Lady Featherstone did not forgive easily. A duke's fortune married to a nobody's daughter, she was fond of remarking to anyone who would listen, is nothing more than a debt wearing a coronet. She had, over the intervening months, cultivated a very particular grievance, nursed carefully in London drawing rooms, that the new Duchess of Rothwell was an unremarkable nobody who had somehow trapped a duke through her father's debts, and had no business whatsoever presuming to a title so far above her plain and portionless station. When the Rothwells came to London for the season, as duty and the Dowager's insistence required, Lady Featherstone was waiting. The first ball was, on its surface, unremarkable. Eleanor wore a gown of soft grey blue that suited her well enough, without pretending to a beauty she did not possess, and she stood, for a long while, at the edge of the ballroom floor beside the Dowager, watching the dancing with the particular composure of a woman who had long practice at being overlooked and had made a kind of peace with it. It was Lady Featherstone who broke that peace, drifting near with 2 other ladies in her wake, her voice pitched just precisely to carry. "I had heard," she said, to no one in particular, and to everyone within 10 feet, that the Duke of Rothwell married in rather a hurry to settle a debt. One does wonder what a man like that could possibly have seen in her. She is not, one must say, precisely the sort of bride one pictures for a duke. Her eyes moved over Eleanor with the slow, deliberate cruelty of a woman who knew exactly how much such a look could cost. Too plain by half, I should think, for such a title. Though I suppose one must take whatever settles a debt, however dull the coin. Eleanor felt the words land the way she had felt 100 such words land across a childhood of being the daughter, who was not the pretty one, and she found to her own quiet surprise that they did not undo her the way they once might have. She had spent a winter on her knees reviving a garden no one had asked her to revive. She had found money bleeding out of the estate's accounts that 3 years of stewards had missed. She knew, in a way she had not known at 20, precisely what she was worth, whatever this room believed. She said nothing. She simply waited. But the Dowager beside her had gone very still, the particular stillness of a woman gathering herself to strike, and across the room, though neither woman yet knew it, the Duke of Rothwell had gone equally still, having heard every word, and Lady Featherstone, satisfied with the damage of one evening, was already turning her mind toward a far larger stage on which to finish what she had begun. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Gideon did not cross the room at once. He had learned, in 3 years of managing men who thought a title was an invitation to be baited into a public scene, that the worst possible response to Lady Featherstone's kind of cruelty was an immediate, visible fury, which she would only use afterward as further proof of some scandal beneath the surface. He crossed the room slowly, correctly, and it was only when he reached his wife's side and saw the particular careful blankness she had arranged over her face. The blankness, he understood now watching her, of a woman braced against a blow she had absorbed 100 times before, and had simply decided, long ago, not to let show, that something in his chest went cold and hard, and entirely certain. "Lady Featherstone," he said, and his voice was perfectly pleasant, perfectly correct, and utterly without warmth. "I do not believe you have been introduced properly to my wife's accomplishments. Perhaps another evening. For now, I believe this dance is promised to her." He offered Eleanor his arm. She took it, and if her hand trembled slightly, no one in the room but Gideon felt it. And he pressed his own hand briefly, warmly, over hers, before leading her onto the floor. He did not say anything to reassure her in words that evening. He did not need to. He danced with her, correctly, formally, in front of the whole assembled ton, in a manner that made abundantly clear to anyone watching precisely whose side he had taken, and precisely how little patience he had for any suggestion otherwise. It was not the declaration the room deserved. It was, Eleanor thought, watching his carefully composed face as they turned through the figures of the dance, something better. The quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who did not need an audience to know what he believed. But Lady Featherstone was not a woman who abandoned a grievance for one setback, and over the following weeks her campaign only sharpened, moving from open drawing-room slights to something more deliberate and more dangerous, whispers, carried carefully from house to house. That the new Duchess of Rothwell had been discovered altering the estate accounts to her own advantage, skimming funds meant for tenants and servants into some private purse, taking advantage of a besotted husband too blind with new affection to see what was plainly happening under his own roof. One does hate to say it of a friend's connection, she confided to a table of card players one evening, in the particular tone of a woman who had never once hated saying anything of the kind. But a girl raised counting pennies does not simply stop counting them once a duke's fortune is within reach. It was, of course, precisely backward. Eleanor had spent a winter correcting years of losses, not creating them, but a rumor delivered with sufficient confidence needed no truth to travel. And by the third week of the season, it had reached every drawing room worth mentioning, each retelling adding a fresh and uglier detail. Eleanor learned of the full scope of it from the Dowager, who did not soften the account, because the Dowager had never believed softening did anyone credit. "They are saying," the old woman told her over a private breakfast, "that you have been robbing your own husband blind. Featherstone's doing, though she is clever enough to keep her own name out of the worst of it. She means for it to reach Lady Ashdown's ball on Thursday. She has arranged, I am told, for someone to raise the matter publicly, before witnesses, where it will do the most damage. And Gideon?" "Gideon," said the Dowager, with a look that was almost, though not quite gentle, "is currently in his study, going through 3 years of ledgers to prepare a defense so thorough that Featherstone will regret she ever learned to speak. But girl, you ought to know that some part of this room will believe the rumor regardless of what he says, because it is easier to believe a plain girl trapped a duke through trickery than to believe a duke simply came, in time, to value her. You must decide now whether you can bear that, whichever way Thursday falls." Eleanor sat a long moment, with her tea cooling in front of her, and thought of a rose garden she had cleared with her own 2 hands because it deserved clearing, and a ledger she had corrected because the tenants deserved their due, and a brother whose lungs had healed in a warm house because she had asked for that safety plainly, instead of accepting whatever scraps of security had been offered her. She had spent 23 years being underestimated. She found, examining the fear in her own chest, that she was more tired of being underestimated than she was afraid of Lady Featherstone. "I can bear it," she said. "I have borne worse for less reason. The days leading up to Lady Ashdown's ball were, for Gideon, a quiet, methodical fury translated entirely into paperwork. He did not shout. He did not confront Lady Featherstone directly, which would only have given her the satisfaction of a scene she could reshape to her own advantage afterward. Instead, he sat each evening with Mr. Higgins and with the estate's solicitor, assembling, line by line, a full and irrefutable account of every improvement Eleanor had made to the Rothwell accounts since her arrival, the corrected tenancy on the home farm, the recovered arrears no one else had troubled to chase, the wages restored to two families the old arrangement had quietly shortchanged for years, until the account filled a folio thick enough to answer any accusation with plain, dull, unglamorous fact, which he had learned, in his years of untangling his father's ruin, was very often the most devastating weapon available to an honest man. Eleanor, for her part, did not hide in the days before the ball, though every instinct urged her to. She continued her calls, her correspondence, her rounds of the household, aware that a woman who disappeared from view in the face of a rumor only lent that rumor credibility. It was the dowager who insisted on this course, informing her with characteristic bluntness that cowering was a luxury afforded only to women who had done something to be ashamed of, and Eleanor had done nothing of the kind. She did allow herself, the evening before the ball, one quiet hour in the small parlor of the London house, with a letter from Thomas in her hands, his handwriting grown steadier and more confident with every month of health, full of ordinary boyish complaints about his tutor and enthusiastic accounts of a dog he had adopted at school, and she found in the ordinariness of it a kind of anchor. Whatever the room decided of her tomorrow, this much was real and could not be rumored away. A brother restored to health, a garden restored to bloom, a household restored to order. She folded the letter carefully and set it beside the plain brown ledger she still kept on her writing desk, and went to bed steadier than she had any right to expect, though even as she blew out the candle, some small, unguarded part of her wondered whether steadiness alone would be enough to survive whatever Lady Featherstone had planned for the room full of witnesses waiting at Lady Ashdown's door. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Lady Ashdown's ballroom, on Thursday evening, was lit by more candles than Eleanor had ever seen gathered in one room, the whole of fashionable London arranged in silks and diamonds beneath them, and it was into this glittering crowd, at what Eleanor understood immediately to be a deliberately chosen moment, after supper, when the room was fullest and most attentive, that Lady Featherstone made her move. She did not approach directly. She was too practiced for that. She engineered, instead, a conversation near enough to the Duke and Duchess of Rothwell to be overheard, raising, with theatrical reluctance, the concerning rumors she had heard regarding the management of the Rothwell estate accounts, wondering aloud, to a small but growing audience, whether a young woman with no fortune and no experience of great houses might not find the temptation of unsupervised access to a duke's ledgers rather more than her character could withstand, whatever her husband's blind devotion might currently prevent him from seeing. It is only, she added, with the particular softness of a woman delivering the cruelest line of the evening, as though it pained her to say it, that some women are raised to manage a household, Your Grace, and others are merely raised to want one. The room around them had gone quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when it senses a spectacle it does not wish to miss. Eleanor felt every eye in the room settle on her, and she felt, too, the old childhood instinct rise in her throat, to shrink, to apologize, to make herself smaller so as not to give anyone more reason to look. And she made herself, deliberately, stand straighter instead. It was Gideon who spoke first, and when he did, his voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It carried through that glittering room with the particular clarity of a man who has never once needed to shout to be heard. My wife, he said, has in 8 months corrected 3 years of losses that 4 stewards before her failed to notice, secured the tenancy of every family on the Rothwell home farm against terms that had been quietly ruining them since my father's time, and revived a garden my mother planted that I had believed, until last spring, was as dead as she is. If Lady Featherstone would care to examine the actual accounts, rather than the rumour of them, my steward will show her the ledgers himself. In my wife's own hand, this evening, in this house, before every person in this room. He paused. The room had gone entirely still. She is not too plain for a duke, he said, and his voice did not waver at all. She is too fine for a room that has never once troubled itself to look past her face before deciding what she was worth. The silence that followed was the particular total silence of a room that has just watched its favorite entertainment turn, with no warning at all, entirely against the woman who had engineered it. Lady Featherstone, for the first time in a decade of drawing-room warfare, found herself with nothing whatsoever to say, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch a humiliation began, in ones and twos, to turn instead toward Eleanor with expressions that ranged from shame to something that might, in time, become respect. Gideon did not wait for the room to finish its recalculation. He took Eleanor's hand, in front of all of them, and his voice, when it came again, had dropped something of its public formality, so that for a moment it seemed almost as though the two of them stood alone in the crowded room. I did not marry you to settle a debt, Eleanor. I married you because I had grown so tired of being valued for what I owned that I had forgotten what it was to be valued at all, and you were the first person in a decade who wanted to know what I was worth beyond a title and a fortune I no longer entirely had. I have spent 3 years certain that no one would ever look at me again without first looking at my ledgers. I was wrong only about you, and I did not have the courage to say so until a room full of strangers forced my hand. I love you. I should have said it months ago, in the quiet of our own house, where it would have cost me nothing to say. I am saying it here instead, in front of every person who ever doubted you, so that none of them may ever again pretend they did not hear it plainly. Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime being the daughter who was overlooked, stood in the middle of the most glittering ballroom in London and found that she was, for the first time in her life, entirely and unmistakably seen by the one person whose seeing had ever truly mattered. I love you as well, she said, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake at all. I believe I have for some time. The room, having nothing left to gossip about that did not reflect poorly upon itself, began, awkwardly, to applaud. The scandal, such as it had been, collapsed within the week, as scandals do when the truth arrives more interesting than the rumor. Lady Featherstone found the doors of several houses considerably less open to her that season than they had been the last, a consequence she had, by all accounts, entirely brought upon herself. Eleanor found herself, rather to her own bemusement, something of a minor celebrity of the ton, not for her beauty, which had not changed, but for the particular steadiness with which she had weathered a public humiliation and emerged, by her husband's own public word, entirely vindicated. They returned to Rothwell Park before the season's end, both of them glad to leave London's glitter for the quieter, truer glitter of a garden coming into its second full bloom. 10 months after that evening in Lady Ashdown's ballroom, the walled garden at Rothwell Park was in its fullest flower. The white rose bush that had survived 3 years of neglect, now the anchor of a bed thick with new growth. And it was there, on a warm afternoon, with bees working steadily through the blooms, that Eleanor sat with her husband and watched their infant daughter sleep in a basket set carefully in the shade, while Thomas, 16 now and broad-shouldered and entirely recovered, argued cheerfully with the dowager over a game of cards on the garden bench nearby. Mr. Higgins, the steward, had long since stopped resisting the Duchess's oversight of the ledgers and had, in fact, taken to consulting her on matters he would once have handled entirely alone, a development he bore with considerably more grace than anyone in the household had initially expected of him. The estate ran true, the tenants prospered, the house, once cold with a grief no one had spoken of, had learned, slowly, how to be warm again without pretending the grief had never happened at all. Gideon's mother's portrait hung still in the gallery, and Eleanor had made certain it always would, because she had come to understand that loving a house's past was not a betrayal of its present. Old Fenwick, now permitted to spend his days entirely among the roses he had tended for 40 years, had taught the young under-gardener his careful grafting trick before his hands grew too unsteady to manage it himself. And the white rose bush that had survived 3 years of neglect now had daughters growing in 3 separate beds, each one, Fenwick liked to say, a little stubborn, a little slow to bloom, and all the finer roses for it. Eleanor thought there was no comparison she liked better. Louisa had written, that spring, a stiff but genuine letter of congratulation upon the birth of her niece. The first real warmth Eleanor could recall receiving from her sister in either of their lives. And though the old habits of their household had not vanished entirely, their mother still wrote more often of Louisa's own upcoming match to a comfortable squire than of anything in Eleanor's life. Eleanor found she minded it a good deal less than she once had. She had built, at Rothwell Park, a family of her own, choosing as much as of blood, a husband who valued her plainly and said so, a brother restored to health and laughter, a dowager who had become as dear to her as any grandmother, and a household of servants and tenants who greeted her by name with real affection, rather than distant courtesy. It was, she had come to think, a finer inheritance than any dowry could have purchased. The dowager, watching the small family gathered among the roses from her bench, declared to Thomas, with her usual bluntness, that she had never in her life expected to grow fond of a household again, after burying 2 husbands and a son. And yet, here she was, entirely undone by a baby who did nothing but sleep, and a granddaughter-in-law who had taught an old woman that it was not, after all, too late to be surprised by happiness. Thomas, laying down a winning hand of cards with the particular satisfaction of a boy who had just bested a duchess at whist, told her cheerfully that he had never doubted it for a moment. Gideon had given her, that morning, a new ledger, bound in blue leather with her initials worked in gold at the corner, a small private joke between them, the kind that only 2 people who had built a marriage out of ledgers and roses rather than jewels and flattery could fully understand, to replace the plain brown one he had first pressed into her hands in a London library, which she had kept regardless, worn soft at the corners now, and which sat still on the shelf in her own private sitting room, the first thing he had ever given her, and, in its way, still the truest. "Do you remember," she said, watching their daughter's small chest rise and fall in its basket, "what you told me, in your library, the very first time we spoke, that you required someone with no illusions?" "I remember," Gideon said, and something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the same almost she had learned, over 2 years, to watch for, and to treasure precisely because it came so rarely, and meant, when it did, so very much. "I find I was wrong about a great many things that evening. I did not require someone without illusions, Eleanor. I required you. I simply did not yet know it." She reached over and took his hand among the roses, and neither of them needed a room full of witnesses to know, this time, exactly what had been said. Above them, the white rose bush that had outlasted 3 years of neglect, and 1 very cold house stirred faintly in the afternoon breeze, its daughters blooming steadily in the beds around it, stubborn and plain, and entirely unremarkable to any eye that did not know to look closely, and altogether, Eleanor thought, the finest thing in the whole garden. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss new stories.